Hey, I am really excited to be up here sharing with you guys this morning. It's a rare opportunity that I get because I get the privilege of teaching the kids during Awana and VBS. I get to teach the youth on Sunday mornings and Sunday nights. I get to hang out with the young adults on Monday nights. And every now and again, I get to hang out with you guys here on Sunday mornings. And so this is a fantastic opportunity for us all to be together. And I'm really excited for today. Today will obviously be a little bit different. It'll be a little bit of a shorter message. It'll be a little bit of a less serious message, but I think it's still going to be good and fun. So the way I'm going to do this, I want to start off by asking a question. And I do this sometimes with my kids. So I want to ask you, who is your favorite superhero? So if you have an answer, just go ahead and just raise your hand. Who's your favorite superhero? If none of you guys participate, this is not going to work. So Colin, all right, who do you got? Spider-Man, thank you, Colin. Loud and proud from the sound booth. All right, who else? I see a hand right here. Who's your favorite superhero?
Wonder Woman.
Wonder Woman, that's a fantastic one. I hear some cheers for Wonder Woman. All right, over there.
Iron Man.
Iron Man, okay, great example. Who else?
Mighty Mouse.
Mighty Mouse. Love that. Yes, absolutely. All right, Paul?
Metro Man.
Who?
Metro Man.
Metro Man, okay, all right. And Carolyn? What's that? Daredevil, okay, all right. So we love really good superheroes, right? So today, as we're doing this series called Curious Bible Stories, I thought that we would talk about, I think, one of the world's first actual genuine superheroes. His name is Samson. So if you have your Bibles, we're going to be looking at the story of Samson, and the book we're going to be looking at is Judges. We're going to be jumping right into Judges chapter 13. If you don't know anything about the book of Judges, let me give you a little bit of context. So there was a period of time where Israel was in this cycle of apostasy and redemption, meaning they did what God wanted them to do, and then they abandoned God. And they were in this big cycle where they were constantly listening to God, constantly ignoring God. And so God sent a series of judges to his people to help rule over them during these different times. And it's in the book of Judges we get some of the most fantastic, and I want to say some of the weirdest stories the Bible has to offer. So, like every good origin story, it began a long, long time ago in a land far, far away, okay? Israel, due to their faithlessness, found themselves at the mercy of a foreign enemy. It's the Philistines. Now, nobody is entirely sure where the Philistines came from. They're sort of this mysterious people. But one thing that's really clear from the book of Judges is that God often used Israel's enemies to punish them for their wickedness and their idolatry. Israel would often cry out to a God that they had so often abandoned. And so God would raise up heroes. These heroes were known as the Judges, and this is the story of one of the most unlikely of them all. So, this is the birth of Samson, again, starting in chapter 13. Now, a couple things to know about this story. The story of Samson is one that is dominated by the women in his life. So you'll see this as we look through the story of Samson. You'll see that he is constantly at the beck and whim of the women that are in his life. The first one is the most fitting, of course, it's his mother. So this is how it starts. It says, the Israelites did what was evil in the sight of the Lord, so the Lord handed them over to the Philistines. There was a certain man from Zorah, from the family of Dan, whose name was Manoah, and his wife was unable to conceive and had no children. The angel of the Lord appeared to the woman and said to her, it is true that you are unable to conceive and have no children, but you will conceive and give birth to a son. Now, please be careful not to drink wine or beer or eat anything unclean, for indeed you will conceive and give birth to a son. You must never cut his hair, because the boy will be a Nazirite to God from birth, and he will begin to save Israel from the power of the Philistines. So Samson's mother, who goes unnamed, is unable to bear children. This is a theme that we often see in the Bible, where God wants to perform something miraculous, and so he uses individuals and families who, up until God's divine intervention, were unable to conceive. And he does this with Samson's mother. So an angel comes down, and he delivers this message. Angels often took many different forms. We see this throughout the Bible, right? There are some examples where they show up as ordinary-looking men. This is often when they show up as messengers from God. And then if you read in like the book of Revelation, there are sometimes angels appear, and it seems that their forms are terrifying, because the first thing they will often say when they show up is, "Don't be afraid." So in this particular instance, we have an angel that appears as a messenger of the Lord, and he came with a prophecy and an expectation. Right? This is just like every good origin story we've ever heard. He says, your son is going to take the Nazirite vow. This is something that we find in the book of Numbers, chapter 3. And we don't need to read the entire thing, but there are 3 things that are really important for you to understand about the Nazirite vow. The first is that they cannot have any drink of alcohol whatsoever. No beer, no wine, nothing like that. The second thing is that they are not to cut their hair during the time they take this Nazirite vow. And the third thing is they are not to touch any dead bodies. Now, I know that sounds like a strange thing to say, but keep those things in mind because we're going to come back to those in just a second. So his mother is told that her son will save them from the Philistines. Now, we see verse 6, entering in is the father. This is a man that Samson may have gotten his wits from. And if you know the story of Samson, that's not a compliment. So basically, the father runs in, and she says, a man from God has appeared to me. And he basically says, nuh-uh, bring him back. I want to talk to him, right? So he's like, I want to be in charge. I want to have the power. I don't think it's that he didn't believe her so much as he just wanted to have some control. And so he says, I want to talk to this man. The Lord honors his request, and the angel of the Lord comes back to deliver a message. Now, I kind of like this interplay because it's kind of interesting, right? So the man's name is Manoah. So he comes back out, and he says, are you the man who spoke to my wife? I am, the angel replies. And Manoah says, when your words come true, what will the boy's responsibilities be? The angel looks at him, and he's like, dude, I told your wife all these things. Like, why are you asking me? He says, literally, I've told your wife all these things. She must not eat anything that comes from a grapevine, and she must not eat anything unclean. Your wife must do everything I commanded her. And so already we get kind of an oblivious man who's saying, like, well, what am I supposed to do? He's like, I literally just told your wife. Just pay attention, man. Listen to her. Okay. So then Manoah says, please stay here. I'm going to prepare a young goat. And he says, well, if you do, that's great, but I can't eat anything that you're going to prepare for me. And he goes, well, can you at least tell me your name? And the angel says, you wouldn't get it, right? So he's already kind of talking a little bit down to Manoah. It's like, man, I've already given you the instruction. You're asking some silly questions. So he says, go ahead, and if you're going to give an offering, make it a burnt offering. So as Manoah and his wife give up a burnt offering, it says the angel of the Lord stepped into the flame and went up into the sky. Just phenomenal, like miraculous thing. Manoah immediately freaks out. He falls down on his face, and he says, we're certainly going to die because we've seen God. Now, again, his wife, kind of the brains in this operation, tries to talk him back. And she's like, listen, hun, sweetheart, bless your heart. If the Lord had intended to kill us, he wouldn't have accepted the burnt offering and the grain offering from us. He would not have shown us all these things or spoken like this to us. So she kind of like talks him back, all right? It's like, stop worrying about it. You're so sweet. A little simple, but sweet. And the Bible says that she gave birth to a boy and she named him Samson. Now, the name Samson could mean something like sunny boy. So that's Samson. He's a sunny boy. So now we keep on going into Judges 14. Now, I do want to draw attention to a word here because this is an important word. So in Judges 13, verse 25, it says, the Spirit of the Lord began. That word began is important. The Spirit of the Lord began to stir him in the camp of Dan between Zorah and Eshtaol. Okay, so now we've got our origin story, right? A prophecy foretold, a child coming into the world. He's named, and it says the Spirit of the Lord began to stir in him. God is going to do something mighty through Samson. Now, I want to give you a heads up. What transpires in the next 2 chapters of Judges are some of the looniest passages in the Bible. Okay, this is a highly unusual story filled with some highly unusual things, and I think it's incredibly entertaining. But there's a very important reason why all of these things happened. The reason is that God wanted to use Samson as an agent of deliverance. And so, as silly as some of the things are to follow, it's important to know that God intended all of these things to accomplish his purpose. This is kind of a theme that we see with the book of Samson, that God is constantly using an unfit judge to accomplish his divine will. So, God wanted to enact this judgment, and so he raises up Samson. Now, we just jump right into Samson being an adult. It says Samson went down to Timnah, and he saw a young Philistine woman there. He went back to his father and mother and said, I have seen a young Philistine woman in Timnah. Now get her for me as a wife. Basically, he saw her, and she's like, she's hot, I want her, right? It's a great dating strategy. That's actually how I got my wife. I looked at her, and I was like, dibs. I'm kidding. That did not happen. But like, that's kind of what he does, right? So Samson looks at her, he's like, oh, she's good looking, and he goes back to mom and dad, he's like, I want. Okay, so his parents are a little bit distraught because they were hoping that he would marry from amongst their own people. And he says, can't you find a woman among your relatives or among our people? Must you go to the uncircumcised Philistines for a wife? But Samson said, get her for me. She's the right one for me. So he basically just says, I want, get her for me. Now this is, again, an important note, that Samson was acting as Israel often did. Israel at this time was acting impetuously. The phrase is often used, they did what was right in their own eyes. So Samson is an embodiment of Israel at the time. He looks, he's not really thinking, and he says, get her for me, that's what I want. So his parents decide to acquiesce, and they decide that they're going to do this. And verse 4 again reminds us of the purpose. Verse 4 in chapter 14 says, now his father and mother did not know this was from the Lord, who wanted the Philistines to provide an opportunity for confrontation. At that time, the Philistines were ruling Israel. That is the biggest understatement of this chapter. So, off they go, and Samson, so they're going down basically to make this sort of an offer. And as they're going, Samson makes a detour. It's not entirely clear why he does this. But it's at this point in the Bible that we begin to see the start of his absolutely freakish strength. Okay? So Samson went down to Timnah with his father and mother and came to the vineyards of Timnah. Suddenly, a young lion came roaring at him. The Spirit of the Lord came powerfully on him, and he tore the lion apart with his bare hands as he might have torn a young goat. Okay, now in case you failed to recognize what a weird phrase that was, let me draw your attention to it. It says, he tore it apart as he might have a young goat. What? I read this passage and I was thinking, what the heck? Was this like a common thing? Were people just like going into petting zoos and be like, whoa, just like ripping goats apart? Did Samson do, I think my suspicion is that at some point Samson might have been known for doing this horrible party trick, right? He's just like walking in, he's like, hey, you guys want to see something cool? And just that's kind of what I think. It's a really disturbing imagery as one would a young goat. It's just so casual. Maybe that was just like a phrase back then. You know, like, oh man, I'm really going to go to town on this hamburger as one would a young goat. Am I right? I don't know. But that's how he phrases it. So he tore it apart as one would a young goat. And you're like, cool, Samson, super weird. He didn't tell his parents, which was reasonable, because that's a crazy thing to say. So now we fast forward in time, right? So he basically meets this Philistine woman. He's like, yes, I want her. And so they set up a marriage. Now, as the time progresses, they're going back to the official wedding. And Samson makes a detour because he wanted to go check on that lion he apparently shredded with his bare hands. Now, this is very strange, but he found that the lion carcass was there, and somehow a hive of bees had actually made a hive in there, and there was honey in there. Now, I told you that there are 3 things to keep in mind about the Nazirite vow, one of which is that you're not supposed to touch dead bodies, and the lion carcass absolutely would have qualified. So by Samson going and touching this lion carcass, he is violating an aspect of the Nazirite vow that was so important for him. Now, a normal person might look at a lion carcass and see there's bees in there and think, ew, gross, and keep walking, but Samson was like, I'm gonna get me some of that honey. And that's what he does. He goes in, and it says he scoops up the honey, and he eats it, and then he goes and offers the honey to his parents. Okay, pro tip, if somebody's coming with honey hands, don't eat that. You don't know where it came from. You have no idea if they've washed their hands. But he's like, look, mom and dad, hand honey. And they're like, okay, cool. And his parents ate it. This is not only is he violating his Nazirite vow by touching a dead lion, but he then also makes his parents complicit in this by touching something unclean and then offering it to his parents. If you haven't picked up already, Samson's not like a great guy, but God is still going to use him. Okay, so at the wedding, he's at the wedding, and again, you kind of get an idea for just how unhinged Samson is. So it says that he was given 30 men to accompany him. Biblical scholars kind of believe that maybe they were acting as like a bodyguard because he was an unknown quantity. So his 30 friends were there. And he comes to his 30 friends, and he says, let me tell you a riddle. He goes, if you can explain to me during the 7 days of this feast, of this wedding, and figure it out, I will give you 30 linen garments and 30 changes of clothes. But if you can't explain it to me, you must give me 30 linen garments and 30 changes of clothes. Tell us your riddle, they replied. Let's hear it. So he says to them, out of the eater came something to eat, and out of the strong came something sweet. And they were unable to figure it out. No duh, what a weird riddle that is. Who in their right mind would be able to figure out a riddle like that? Out of the eater came something to eat, and out of the strong came something sweet. That's not a riddle. You know what is a good riddle? What has keys and yet can't open any locks? Anybody know? Piano? I heard it over there. Okay, all right. What has a thumb and 4 fingers but isn't a hand? A glove. See, that's a good riddle. Or what is so fragile that saying its name breaks it? Silence. Ooh, okay, some of you guys know this. Okay, those are good riddles. What Samson offered was a bonkers nonsense riddle, okay? So they're understandably confused. They can't figure this out at all. And so they go to the bride, and they said, listen, if you don't get us the answer to this riddle, we're going to burn you and your entire family. Right, which is rude. The wedding registry asked for a crock pot, not being burned alive, okay? So they come and they threaten his family, and they said, this is what's going to happen. I don't know if she communicated this to Samson or not, but what is clear is for the next 3 days, she begs and pleads with him reasonably, because remember the punishment. She begs and pleads with him and says that she nags him, and Samson just continues to ignore her until finally he acquiesces. And then they come back and they deliver the answer, and they say, what is sweeter than honey? What is stronger than a lion? To which he responds, if you hadn't plowed with my young cow, you wouldn't know my riddle now. Just in case you're wondering, it's just as insulting then as it is now to call anybody, especially a woman, a cow, okay? That's not like a cultural, you don't need to know anything cultural, it's just an insult, okay? So they guessed their riddle, and so Samson had to get them 30 garments of linen, so he went shopping. I'm just kidding. He murdered 30 dudes. That's what he did. He goes down to a town and he kills 30 men, and he comes back with like the linen. And I'm sure they're wondering, like, thank you. Why is there blood on it? He's like, just ignore that, right? So he gives them this, and then he storms off. He's super angry, and so he left and he goes back to his father's house. Now, as a result of this, the bride, who I told you that his story is dominated by women, the bride, who's never named, is then given to another guest at the wedding. Either the best or the worst party gift, I don't know. So fast forward, now we're in Judges chapter 15. It says, later on during the harvest, Samson took a young goat as a gift to his wife. Maybe he's like, hey, you want to see his party trick? I don't think so. But so he goes back to his young wife, and when he arrives, what he thought was his father-in-law says, I didn't know that you wanted to stay married to her, so I gave her to somebody else. But don't worry, she's got a younger sister who's way more beautiful. Yeah, I know, this guy's not great. Okay, so this is what Samson says in verse 3. He says, this time I will be blameless when I harm the Philistines. That should be an ominous thing, right? This guy's already proven that he's a little unhinged, and so now he's saying, cool, now no one can blame me for what happens next, okay? So, again, so he does one of the weirdest things, okay? I don't know if you're going to get revenge on somebody. I don't know what you would do. Samson went out and he captured 300 foxes with his bare hands. I don't know how he caught them. I don't know where he kept them. And I don't know why it had to be so many, but he takes 300 foxes. He ties their tails together, puts a torch, and he's like, yeah! And they go out and they burn all the grain down on the Philistine lands. So the Philistines are rightfully furious with them. They wanted revenge, but they were unable to find Samson. And so they come and they start asking questions. Who is this crazy person with all the foxes? And as they go back, people report, well, he's married to this person. So they go back to the family, and when they can't find Samson, in a moment of supreme irony, they do exactly to Samson's ex-wife and ex-father-in-law that they had threatened during the wedding, and they burn the entire family. So Samson is upset. And as so often the case, violence begets violence. So Samson decides that he is now going to act yet another act of revenge. So basically, he goes, he's hiding in a cave, right? And the Philistines came to the Israelites and they said, "Get us Samson." And so instead of going to war with their enemy, they go and they capture one of their own. And they come to Samson and they're like, "Look, we're going to turn you over to the Philistines." And Samson was like, "Cool, on one condition, don't kill me, just tie me up." And they're like, "Yep, no problem." Okay, so they tie him up and they bring him before the Philistines. And it says that as he's walking up with his hands bound, the Philistines cry out for joy because here is their bound enemy. The moment that they do that, you probably know the story, he shreds off the binding. He sees a donkey carcass, which again, touching a dead body. He takes out the jawbone, and it says that he proceeds to kill 1,000 people. 1,000 is so many people. Look around this room. I asked Joe, and he said that we initially set up about 409 chairs. That's like double you guys. 1,000 people with a donkey jawbone? That's insane. I don't know how he accomplished that. I don't know if maybe they just like made a single file line and just came at him one at a time. They're like, "Go get him, slugger." "Oh, no, next." And I don't know what they're doing. But all I know is that 1,000 Philistines die by the hand of this absolute lunatic with a bone. That's a crazy thing to happen, okay? So he wipes out 1,000 Philistines. Now keep in mind, God had always intended for this man to seek revenge against the Philistines. They had no idea how creative God was going to be in doing it. So it does. So he takes out 1,000 dudes, and it says at the end, it says that he named the place Jawbone Hill because of course he did, right? Like, it wasn't an imaginative, I mean, riddles, sure, but like he's like, bunch of dead bodies, Jawbone Hill. He might have actually just been referring to like the pile of dead bodies. We don't know. But then, he sings this song about himself. He says, "With the jawbone of a donkey, I piled them in heaps. With the jawbone of a donkey, I have killed 1,000 men." It's a really catchy tune. Maybe you'll find yourself singing it on the way home. Okay? So God does this act, and Samson is like, "Ta-da, I'm awesome." So then he says, "God, you've accomplished this great thing through your servant." And then he cries out and he says, "But I'm thirsty." And says, so God opens up a well and gives him a drink of water. The only time he acknowledges God is when he needs something. That's who Samson is. He doesn't acknowledge God at any other point, but when he's thirsty, he cries out and says, "God, give me something I need." And then it says that he judged Israel for 20 years. I don't know why God, again, sought to put him in a position of power, but that's what it says. Now, in chapter 16, we see Samson getting once more into his chief vice, and it says that he spends time with a lady who, let's just say, has a bad reputation, okay? So it says that he's there, he's in this town, he's with this person, and his enemies, knowing that he is there, surround the town. They're going to capture him, but in the middle of the night, he just wakes up, he goes out to the city gates, and he just picks them up, and he walks with the doors for 40 miles and sticks them on a hill. Once again, what a weird thing to do. Now, I want to take a quick pause right here because I thought I'd kind of do something a little bit fun. Here we are talking about how an invisible force could wield like such power. So I'm going to ask, actually, I'm going to need a couple of help. Here's what I need. I actually need somebody from the audience to help me out. So I'm looking for somebody that you're like, I know a little bit of karate. At least do you feel like you're pretty I'm looking for like a kid. So I need like a kid who can give me like one really good karate chop. Okay, I'm being completely serious, by the way. So I need somebody here. I see a hand. You want to do it? Oh, awesome. Come up here. Okay. All right, and I've got my lovely assistants who are going to be bringing something up here. Yes, I didn't know there was going to be examples. Okay, what's your name?
Hannah.
Hannah. Okay, Hannah. So you feel fairly confident you can give me a good karate chop? Okay, sweet. Okay, so here's what we're going to do. So I've got my assistants are bringing up a table. This is for you, safety first. Okay, here we go. Okay, so now, hold on, we're gonna do this like this. Thank you guys so much. So first, I'm gonna put this off to the side. Okay, now I want you to give me like a light karate chop, not a hard one, just give me a light karate chop. Boom. Okay, so as you can see, if you were just to karate chop that, the stick would just go flying up in the air. But here's the really cool thing. There are invisible forces all around us like air pressure. And so all we need to do is we can cover this stick with a single piece of paper. Okay, now on the count of 3, give me a really good karate chop and chop the heck out of it. Ready? 1, 2, 3. Harder! Harder! You know what? We're gonna go again. Go again. That, you broke it. Good job. I tell you what. As a thank you, you get a super cool hat. Okay. Thank you so much, Hannah. That's the risk you run with things like that. Things don't always go exactly according to plan, but you did an amazing job. That was absolutely awesome. So, usually the Air Force will actually hold something like that down, and when you chop it, it'll snap in half. I think I just chose an extra springy piece of wood. But here's the thing. An invisible force like the Holy Spirit had come upon Samson and given him this incredible strength to do things that God had in mind for him. Now, here's the part of the story that probably most of you guys are most familiar with. It says that another woman comes into Samson's life. So we've had his mother, we've had this mysterious bride, and we have somebody that he had just spent time with. And now, for the first time, a woman named Delilah enters into the picture. Now, we don't exactly know what Delilah means, but some biblical scholars have speculated that her name means of the night. If that's true, what a beautiful poetic story this is. You've got sunny boy Samson versus Delilah of the night. And he is once again giving in to his weakness. Only this time it's actually more tragic because it says that Samson falls in love. And there's a bounty that got put on his head because remember, the Philistines are terrified of him. So they come and they put this bounty on his head. And they said, if you can figure out the source of his strength, we will give you an unimaginable amount of money. So again, if you're ever in a dating relationship and someone starts asking you, what is your weakness? Red flag, okay? Just keep that in mind. So in an attempt to collect the bounty, she asks him over and over again what his kryptonite is. First thing he says is bowstrings to tie him up. And then she cries out, Samson, the Philistines are here, and he shreds them. And then it's new ropes, and he shreds those. Then he says, if you tie my hair to a loom, that will be the secret of my weakness. And she does that too. And every time she cries out, the Philistines are here, and every time he snaps out of him, she reacts with disappointment. I thought you loved me. And so eventually, it says that she continues to nag him. And Samson, who is unable to learn his lesson, gives in. And when he finally confides in her the truth, and he finally tells her about the Nazirite vow, is at this moment that he's truly broken something sacred between him and God. Now granted, Samson had violated his Nazirite vow a few times beforehand. He'd already touched dead bodies. During the festival of his 7-day wedding, it's surmised that there would have been a lot of drinking going on. But this was the first time that Samson intentionally confided what his vow was, and he violated it, and he gave it to an enemy. And so Delilah, knowing that this was the truth, she calls in the Philistines, and she says, this time I got him. And so while he's asleep, she cuts his hair. She says, Samson, the Philistines are here. And poor, foolish Samson wakes up not knowing that his strength was gone and the Philistines captured him. And the eyes that he had so often used to make his decisions were taken from him, and he was blinded. So, I love the way that the story phrases it, though, because it says, after he was taken, I told you to pay attention to this word, began. It says, they seized him, they gouged out his eyes, they brought him down to Gaza, and they bound him with bronze shackles, and he was forced to grind grain in the prison, but his hair began to grow back after it had been shaved. It's like this, like the author is giving you a preview. He's like, but don't worry, the story's not over yet. So here Samson is. He's captive, and they decide to bring him out for this big festival, this big party, and they were using him as entertainment. Maybe he could freestyle rap, I don't know. At this party, though, there was the rulers and officials, and Samson asks to be placed next to load-bearing pillars, which, again, it's kind of a red flag. So as Samson is placed next to load-bearing pillars, it says that he prayed. Now, again, even his prayer is selfish. He's like, God, give me one more chance to strike vengeance for my lost eyes. He still doesn't understand the big picture. He still doesn't know how God is being used, and he still thinks it's all about him. And this final act, although it's selfish, he does it because he wants to get this last bit of revenge. And Samson, who is ever the entertainer, brings the house down. So it says that he braced against the pillars, and he collapses the temple, and he killed more of the enemy in his death than he ever had in his life. I told you this is a strange story. So you might be wondering, okay, all right, we've talked about some strange things. What does all this mean? Well, I've got 3 application points, and therefore are 3 different ages that are here today. Okay, so kids, right? If you're a kid, I want you to look up here, okay? This is the point that I want you to take away from this story. So for kids, it's this. God has given some of you guys really amazing gifts. Some of you guys might be strong like Samson. Some of you guys might be incredibly kind or really, really smart. I think for some of you guys, God has given you this blend of multiple different talents. What I want you to know is that whatever gifts God has given you, He wants you to use them to build up his kingdom. God wants you to be even better than Samson. He wants you to honor him with those gifts and those talents, and he wants you to accomplish great things with the unique gifts that God has given you. Okay, now if you're in youth, all right, so if middle school, high school, here's your takeaway. Take your vow to God seriously. Man, Samson sure didn't. For some of you guys, middle school, high schoolers, you're at this unique point in your spiritual development where you are deciding who you want to become. God is forming you into the men and the women that he wants you to be for the rest of your life. And let me tell you, your decision to follow God is going to be one of the most important things about who you are and what is to follow in the intervening years. And if you're here and you have made a commitment to following God, I want you to take that vow seriously. Samson didn't. Samson chose to continually ignore his vow. He took it as something less serious, and look what happened to him. So if you are here and you're like, I want to follow God, I believe in who God is, take that vow seriously, because again, this will come to define the next 10, 20, 30, 50 years of your entire life. Now for adults, for the rest of us, what are we supposed to learn from this story? And here's this. Don't make the mistake of ignoring your vices. I think that we do this sometimes, and I'm including myself in this. I think that sometimes we have vices or we have sins that we think of as private, not that big of a deal, and we ignore them. And we think, well, it's not really hurting anybody. Samson's chief vice was women. He struggled with lust his entire life. And he downplayed the significance and the seriousness of that. And ultimately, it wound up costing him his life. We sometimes ignore the very thing that can lead to our undoing. So if you know, you're sitting here and you're like, yeah, there's this private thing. I've been holding on to it for a while. I haven't really let it go. I don't think it's that big of a deal. You should know that God has this sort of funny way of exposing what's going on in our hearts. And God's goal for you is to give that vice over to him to be used even greater for his kingdom work. When we know what's going on in your spirit, don't just come to God when the situation is dire. Don't just cry out to God when you want vengeance or when it seems like the end has come. Instead, cry out to God daily. Those with great gifts will be greatly tempted. Release that back to God before disaster strikes. Finally, our imperfections don't limit God's plans. Instead, they serve as an opportunity for God's providence to shine through. God worked through Samson to accomplish his will. God conquers his enemies, and he redeems us from sin, and he does this primarily through his son, Jesus Christ. I'm going to pray and invite the worship band to come back up. God, I thank you for this. I thank you for this story. It's weird and wacky, but God, we can learn something through this. Although Samson was an unusual figure, God, you raised him up for a specific time. I think there are people here today that you want to raise up to accomplish your will in a very specific way. I pray that we would be attuned to what that is and when to listen to your Holy Spirit. I pray that for each one of us who have gifts, whether or not we're strong or we're smart or something in between, I pray that we would use those gifts greatly. I pray that we would take our vow seriously to follow you. I pray that that would stand as an example to other people. And Father, I pray that we wouldn't ignore the things going on inside of our own heart, inside of the hidden chambers that we think no one else can see. Father, you know what those things are. You want us to come to you daily, to give those things over to you. You want to redeem and transform us. I pray that we can learn from Samson's mistakes, that we might not be selfish, we might not be thoughtless. And God, if you can use someone like him, how much greater can you use somebody who fully acknowledges your sovereignty in their life? Thank you for being a good God that loves us. We give all things over to you. In your name, amen.